In the autumn mist of 1809, when the leaves turned the color of dried blood, there stood a manor house in the mountains of West Virginia, where 23 people died in a single evening. The official record calls it a poisoning. The whispered stories call it something else entirely. Picture, if you will, the scene that greeted investigators on that September morning. 21 bodies sprawled around a dining table set with the finest china, their faces twisted in final agony. Overturned wine glasses stained the white tablecloth like wounds. The smell of spoiled meat hung heavy in the air, mixing with something bitter and medicinal that made the sheriff's men cover their faces with handkerchiefs. But what haunted them most was not the death, but the precision of it. Every plate had been served. Every glass had been filled. Every napkin had been folded just so. This was not chaos, this was ceremony. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. The only ones missing from this tableau of horror were two Irish immigrant girls who had served in the house as maids, Aisling and Niamh O'Donnell, who had arrived in the valley seeking honest work and found themselves witnesses to something that would transform them from servants into something far more dangerous. What they discovered in that house, what they learned about their employers, and what they did with that terrible knowledge reveals a truth more chilling than any ghost story. This was not just murder. This was judgment written in poison and served with silver spoons. The settlement of Glory, West Virginia, clung to the sides of a narrow valley like a wound that refused to heal. Black smoke from the mining operation stained the morning mist, and the constant thunder of the stamp mill echoed off the surrounding mountains day and night. It was 1808 when the valley held perhaps 300 souls, most of them immigrants drawn by promises of work that paid enough to send money home to families across the ocean. At the head of the valley, where the Black Ash River emerged from the deep woods, stood the Croftwood Manor. Built of dark local stone and timber, it loomed over the settlement like a judgment seat. From the town below, you could see lights in its windows on winter evenings, warm and welcoming, though no one from the settlement had ever been invited to cross its threshold. The geography itself seemed designed to trap secrets. A single winding road led in and out of the valley, treacherous in good weather and impossible in bad. The river ran too fast and cold for crossing, bordered by marshes that swallowed sound and sight alike. When the mist rolled down from the mountains, which it did most mornings, the world beyond the valley walls simply ceased to exist. The Croftwoods owned everything that mattered. The mine that gave the town its reason for being, the company store where workers spent their wages, the boarding houses where they slept. Even the little church where they prayed for better days was built with Croftwood money and blessed by a minister who took his salary from Croftwood coffers. This was not unusual for mining settlements of that era, but Glory carried an additional weight of silence. Workers spoke of accidents that left no bodies to bury, travelers who asked too many questions about the prosperity of certain local families simply vanished from the record. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the whiskey flowed, men would lower their voices when they spoke of the family on the hill. The very isolation that made Glory profitable made it perfect for other enterprises as well. In a place where the wilderness swallows sounds and souls, what else could it hide? Silas Croftwood stood 6 feet tall and carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to deference. His beard was always perfectly trimmed, his suits tailored in Charleston, his handshake firm but never aggressive. When he walked through the settlement, which he did every few weeks to inspect his holdings, workers touched their caps and wives curtsied as though he were visiting royalty. He was, by all accounts, a thoughtful man, philosophical even. He could quote scripture and Shakespeare with equal facility, discuss the latest scientific discoveries from the universities back east, and hold forth on the moral responsibilities of wealth with genuine passion. The local minister often sought his counsel on matters of doctrine, and visiting businessmen invariably left impressed by his learning and refinement. His wife, Eliza, was equally admired. She organized charity drives for the families of miners killed in accidents, personally delivered baskets of food to the sick, and hosted an annual Christmas feast for the children of the settlement. Her smile was warm, her manner gracious, and her memory for names and faces remarkable. She could ask after a worker's ailing mother or remember the birthday of a child she had met only once. Together they embodied everything the community wanted to believe about the benevolent power of wealth. They were proof that success and virtue could coexist, that those blessed with abundance would share their blessings with those less fortunate. When traveling ministers preached about the eye of the needle and the camel's burden, they always mentioned the Croftwoods as exceptions to the rule. But there were things about the family that people noticed without quite knowing what they were noticing. The way Silas's eyes would linger on newcomers to the settlement, assessing them with the attention a rancher might give to livestock. How Eliza's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at the wives of prosperous visitors. The fact that their dinner parties, always held for potential investors or business partners from distant cities, seemed to attract guests who arrived with great fanfare but departed with none at all. The Croftwoods had 2 sons away at university, fine young men by all accounts, though they rarely visited the family home. Those who remembered them from their youth spoke of polite, well-educated boys who seemed uncomfortable in their parents' presence, as though they carried some burden of knowledge they were not yet ready to bear. Most telling of all was the reaction the family inspired in the settlement's animals. Dogs would whine and press close to their owners when the Croftwoods passed. Horses grew skittish and difficult to manage in their presence. Even the church cats, usually friendly to anyone who might provide a scrap of food, would arch their backs and hiss when either Silas or Eliza approached. But animals cannot testify in court, and the prosperity of glory depended on willful blindness to certain uncomfortable truths. Every performance has its stagehands, and the Croftwoods employed 2 girls who saw behind the curtain. Aisling O'Donnell stepped off the train in glory on a cold morning in March of 1808. Her worldly possessions contained in a single carpetbag, and her cousin Neve clinging to her arm like a lifeline. They had traveled from Cork with promises of steady work and decent wages, part of the great wave of Irish immigrants seeking better lives in the American mountains. Aisling was 24 then, old enough to have seen hard times but young enough to believe they might end. She was quick with numbers, having helped her father in his apothecary's shop before the troubles drove them from Ireland. Her mind worked like clockwork, organizing information, seeing patterns, remembering details others forgot. It was a skill that had served her well during the crossing and would serve her even better in the months to come. Neve was 19, prettier than her cousin and more trusting of the world's promises. She laughed easily, made friends quickly, and possessed the kind of natural charm that opened doors and softened hearts. Where Aisling observed, Neve engaged. Where Aisling calculated, Neve felt. Together they made a formidable team. The position at Croftwood Manor came through Father McKenna, the Irish priest who served the Catholic families in the valley. The family needed household staff, he explained, and were willing to pay wages that would allow the girls to send money home while building a nest egg for their future. The work would be demanding but respectable, and the Croftwoods were known for their fair treatment of employees. What Father McKenna did not mention, perhaps because he did not know, was how quickly household staff seemed to turn over at the manor. What he certainly did not mention, because it would have sounded like the ravings of a madman, was the warning that Liam Byrne had tried to give him just days before the girls' arrival. Liam was 26, a stable hand who had worked for the Croftwoods for almost 2 years. Like the O'Donnell cousins, he had come from Ireland seeking honest work and better prospects. Unlike them, he had begun to notice things that made honest sleep difficult. He spoke to them on their 3rd day in glory, approaching them after Mass with the careful manner of a man sharing dangerous knowledge. The Croftwoods were good employers, he said, but there were aspects of their household that bore watching. The larder, for instance, was kept locked at all times, though he had never seen deliveries large enough to justify such security. Guests came to the manor frequently, but the same faces never appeared twice. And late at night, when the family thought the staff asleep, there were sounds from the cellars that no Christian household should contain. Aisling pressed him for details, but Liam only shook his head. He was planning to leave Glory soon, he said. Find work elsewhere. Perhaps they should consider doing the same once they had earned enough for the journey. 3 days later, Liam Byrne was dead. A rockfall at the mine, according to the official report, though the mine records showed no blasting scheduled for that day and no other workers in the affected area. His body was never recovered, buried too deeply under tons of stone to retrieve safely. The funeral was held without a corpse, and his few possessions were sold to pay for the service. The message was clear to anyone who cared to read it. Ask too many questions in Glory, and the mountains themselves would silence you. A disappearance is one thing, but the silence that follows is another, and it was in that silence that the maids began to listen. The prosperity dinners at Croftwood Manor were legendary throughout the coal counties of West Virginia. Invitations were extended to businessmen from Charleston, Pittsburgh, and even New York, men with capital to invest and appetites to match their ambitions. The meals were elaborate affairs, featuring dishes prepared by Eliza herself, using recipes passed down through generations of Southern hospitality. Silas would greet his guests in the parlor with aged whiskey and talk of opportunity. The coal seam that ran beneath the valley was richer than any in the state, he would explain, but extracting it required modern equipment and substantial investment. The right partners could see returns that would make their fortunes and establish their families for generations to come. Eliza would join them for the preliminary course, charming the visitors with stories of local history and inquiries about their families back home. She had a remarkable memory for personal details, remembering the names of wives and children, asking after business ventures and social connections. Her attention was flattering and complete, making each guest feel like the most important person in the room. The conversation over dinner would range from politics to philosophy, with Silas demonstrating the breadth of his education and the depth of his thinking. He spoke eloquently about the responsibilities of wealth, the dignity of labor, and the moral obligation of those blessed with abundance to share their good fortune with those less fortunate. His guests invariably found themselves impressed by his combination of practical wisdom and ethical sensitivity. "A man is what he consumes," Silas would say, raising his glass for the inevitable toast. "And we, gentlemen, have been blessed to consume only the finest that life has to offer. Tonight, we ingest not just food, but the spirit of this land itself, the essence of prosperity built on solid foundations." From the kitchen, where Aisling and Neve served as both cooks and servers, the toasts sounded like the confident rhetoric of successful men congratulating themselves on their good fortune. It was only later that they would understand the deeper meanings hidden in Silas's carefully chosen words. What struck Aisling as odd, though she could not quite articulate why, was Eliza's attention during these dinners. While Silas held forth on business and philosophy, his wife would study their guests with the focused intensity of a butcher evaluating livestock. She would note which men were traveling alone, which had informed their families of their precise whereabouts. which carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to having their disappearances investigated thoroughly. The guests, flattered by the attention and mellowed by excellent wine, rarely noticed this scrutiny. They saw only a gracious hostess, ensuring their comfort and demonstrating proper interest in their affairs. They did not see the mental ledger she was compiling, the calculations being performed behind her warm smile. The feast was the family's theater, but behind the stage, the maids were about to discover the truth of the props. On a Tuesday evening in late August of 1809, Eliza sent Aisling to the cellar for a bottle of wine to accompany the evening meal. The family was dining alone that night, no guests to impress, and the atmosphere in the house felt relaxed in a way that it rarely did when strangers were present. The wine cellar occupied one corner of the manor's extensive basement, its stone walls lined with racks that held bottles dating back decades. Aisling had been in the cellar many times before, but always with specific instructions about which vintage to retrieve, and always with the understanding that she was to touch nothing beyond what was explicitly requested. This time, however, as she reached for the designated bottle, her elbow struck the wine rack with enough force to shift it slightly on its moorings. The wooden frame, heavier than it appeared, scraped against the stone wall with a grinding sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. As the rack moved, it revealed something that made Aisling's breath catch in her throat. Behind the wine bottles set into the stone wall itself was a narrow door secured with an iron latch. The door was painted the same color as the surrounding stone, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, and sealed with wax around its edges to prevent any telltale odors from escaping. Aisling stood frozen for a moment, wine bottle forgotten in her hands, as she processed what she was seeing. Every instinct told her to replace the wine rack, collect her bottle, and return upstairs as though nothing had happened. But the memory of Liam Burns' warning and the strange circumstances of his death compelled her to investigate further. The iron latch lifted easily, as though it had been used recently and kept well oiled. The door opened inward on silent hinges, revealing a chamber that defied everything Aisling thought she knew about the manor and its inhabitants. The hidden room was perhaps 8 feet square, its walls lined with crude wooden shelves. But instead of wine or preserved food, the shelves held personal possessions, pocket watches and jewelry, obviously valuable, clothing folded and stored with care, books and papers bundled with string, and in one corner, hanging from a wooden peg like a beloved garment, a distinctive waistcoat of coarse Irish wool that Aisling recognized immediately. She had helped Liam mend that waistcoat just weeks before his supposed death in the mine collapse. Had watched him darn a tear in the sleeve, with the patience of a man who owned only one good piece of clothing and intended to make it last. Had listened to him explain how his mother had woven the wool herself, how wearing it made him feel connected to home even in this strange American valley. The waistcoat was clean, carefully brushed, and showed no sign of having been buried under tons of rock. More disturbing still, it had been placed on the peg with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy relics or precious heirlooms. As Aisling's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from the wine cellar, she noticed other items that triggered recognition. A silver locket that had belonged to Mary Sullivan, the Irish girl who had supposedly returned home to tend to a sick mother. A distinctive walking stick carried by the German engineer who had visited the previous spring to assess the mine's equipment needs. A leather portfolio embossed with initials that matched those of the businessman from Pittsburgh who had stayed for 3 days the previous autumn, discussing potential investments before apparently departing without warning. On one of the shelves, partially hidden behind a stack of folded shirts, was a bound notebook. Aisling opened it with trembling fingers to discover a ledger written in Silas's precise handwriting. The entries were cryptic but clearly organized, with dates, names, and what appeared to be menu notations. Spring lamb, tender and mild. Aged beef, rich and marbled. Young pork, sweet and delicate. The final entry, dated just 3 days earlier, made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Autumn's new stock, A. O'Donnell, N. O'Connell. Reserved for harvest feast, September 22nd. With their own names on the menu, the maids realized they were not the servers for the next feast, but the main course. Sleep became impossible after Aisling's discovery in the hidden larder. She had shared her findings with Neve that same night, speaking in whispers behind the closed door of their shared room, and together they had tried to make sense of what they had learned. The evidence was damning but circumstantial, horrible but not quite believable. Surely there had to be another explanation, some innocent reason why the possessions of the dead and missing were stored in a secret room beneath the manor. But the ledger with their names, written in Silas's unmistakable hand, made denial impossible. They were living in a house of predators, serving a family that viewed them as livestock, to be fattened and prepared for slaughter. The question now was not whether they were in danger, but how to escape it. Direct confrontation was impossible. The Croftwoods wielded absolute power in the valley, their word taken as law by everyone from the sheriff to the minister. Any accusation the maids might make would be dismissed as the hysteria of ignorant immigrant girls, particularly if those accusations involved crimes so monstrous that civilized people refused to consider them possible. Flight seemed equally hopeless. The single road out of the valley was watched, and strangers attempting to leave without permission were invariably turned back or reported missing soon after. The surrounding wilderness was treacherous, and neither Aisling nor Neve possessed the skills necessary to survive a journey through unmarked mountain territory. That left only one avenue for confirmation of their fears and possibly assistance in their escape. Doc Henderson had served as the valley's physician and coroner for nearly 15 years, signing death certificates for everyone who died within 20 miles of Glory. If anyone knew the truth about the unusual number of disappearances and suspicious deaths, it would be the man charged with documenting them officially. Aisling approached him on a Thursday morning when he was making his weekly rounds through the settlement. She found him in the company store checking on a miner who had taken ill, and waited until his examination was complete before requesting a private word. Doc Henderson was a thin, nervous man in his 50s, with the pale complexion and trembling hands of someone who relied too heavily on medicinal alcohol to manage the stresses of his profession. His practice in Glory was lucrative but peculiar, with an unusually high number of deaths attributed to mining accidents that left no recoverable bodies, and a corresponding shortage of the chronic illnesses that typically afflicted isolated communities. When Aisling asked to speak with him privately, claiming concern about her own health, he agreed with the weary resignation of a man accustomed to hypochondriacs and imaginary ailments. They walked to his small office behind the pharmacy, where the smell of carbolic acid and patent medicines created an atmosphere of clinical detachment. Aisling began carefully, expressing worry about the number of people who had died or disappeared since her arrival in Glory. Was this typical for mining settlements? Were there diseases or hazards she should know about? Should she and her cousin consider seeking employment elsewhere? Doc Henderson's response was immediate and telling. His hands began to shake more violently, and he poured himself a glass of whiskey from the bottle he kept in his desk drawer. When Aisling pressed him for specifics about the deaths he had documented, his evasions became increasingly frantic. Finally, perhaps because the whiskey had loosened his tongue, or perhaps because the weight of his complicity had become unbearable, he spoke more directly than he had intended. Some bodies, he said, were not meant for a Christian burial. Some deaths required certificates that bore little resemblance to the actual facts, and some families in the valley possessed appetites that extended far beyond what civilized society would consider acceptable. He showed her his filing cabinet, pointing to records that documented impossible patterns of mortality, bodies that supposedly weighed 200 pounds at death, but yielded only 120 pounds of recoverable remains. Mining accidents that occurred in shafts where no work was scheduled. Travelers who died of sudden illness after dining with prominent local families, their symptoms consistent with exotic poisons rather than natural disease. When Aisling asked directly about Liam Byrne, Doc Henderson's composure collapsed entirely. There had been no rockfall, he admitted, no mining accident. No body buried under tons of stone. Liam Byrne had died in the manner of causes that Doc Henderson refused to specify, and his death certificate was a fabrication designed to prevent questions that might prove dangerous for everyone involved. Before dismissing her, Doc Henderson offered one final piece of advice. Whatever she thought she knew about certain families in glory, she should forget immediately. Whatever plans she might be making for herself and her cousin, she should abandon in favor of absolute compliance with their employer's wishes. And whatever she did, she must never speak of their conversation to anyone, because the consequences would be swift and final for both of them. A doctor's fear was all the diagnosis they needed. The sickness was in the manor itself, and the only cure was a radical one. The knowledge that they were marked for death should have paralyzed the O'Donnell cousins with terror, but instead it crystallized their thinking with remarkable clarity. They had perhaps 3 weeks until the harvest feast scheduled for September 22nd. 3 weeks to devise a plan that would either save their lives or ensure that their deaths would not go unavenged. Direct escape remained impossible. Hiram Stokes, the manor's groundskeeper, had been instructed to monitor their movements, and they had noticed him watching them with increasing attention over the past several days. Any attempt to flee would be reported immediately, and they would be returned to the manor before they had traveled a mile from its grounds. But their enforced captivity also provided opportunities that a more conventional escape plan would not. They had access to the manor's kitchen with its extensive collection of spices, herbs, and preserving compounds. They had detailed knowledge of the family's routines and dining preferences. Most importantly, they had advance warning of exactly when and how the Croftwoods planned to kill them. Aisling's knowledge of chemistry, learned from her father's apothecary practice, became their most valuable asset. She knew which common plants contained deadly alkaloids, how to extract and concentrate their poisons, and how to disguise bitter compounds in strongly flavored foods. What she needed now was access to the right botanical specimens and privacy to prepare them properly. The mist-shrouded woods that surrounded the valley were rich in toxic flora, particularly during the late summer months when many dangerous plants reached their peak potency. Hemlock grew wild in the dampest areas, its hollow stems and delicate white flowers easily recognizable to anyone with botanical training. Foxglove flourished in the partially shaded areas beneath the forest canopy, its beautiful purple blooms concealing cardiac poisons that killed swiftly and inevitably. On the Sunday before the feast, while the Croftwoods attended services in town, Aisling and Neve ventured into the woods under the pretense of gathering blackberries for preserves. They carried wicker baskets and wore their most innocent expressions, but their true purpose was far darker than any legitimate foraging expedition. The hemlock was easy to find and harvest. Aisling cut the stems carefully, avoiding contact with the poisonous sap, and wrapped the pieces in cloth for transport back to the manor. The plant's toxicity was legendary, but its bitter taste made concealment difficult, requiring careful planning to disguise its presence in food. The foxglove required more delicate handling. Aisling had to extract the cardiac glycosides from the flowers and leaves, a process that involved drying, grinding, and steeping the plant material in alcohol, stolen from the manor's medical supplies. The resulting tincture was colorless and nearly tasteless, making it ideal for concealment in wine or stock. As they worked in the secluded root cellar where they had hidden their preparations, neither woman spoke about the moral implications of what they were planning. They had been marked for death by creatures wearing human faces, and their survival depended on responding with the same ruthless efficiency their predators had shown to previous victims. The transformation from servants to avengers was complete when Aisling carefully sealed the final vial of concentrated poison and placed it alongside the others in their hidden cache. They were no longer prey waiting helplessly for slaughter, but hunters preparing to turn the tables on their would-be killers. With the poison prepared, they had only to wait for the night of the feast and rewrite the menu from the inside. While Neve focused on memorizing the routines and preferences of their intended victims, Aisling devoted her analytical mind to understanding the full scope of the horror they had uncovered. If they were going to risk everything on a single desperate gambit, she wanted to ensure that their actions would end the Croftwood family's predations permanently, rather than simply delaying them. The hidden ledger she had discovered proved to be only one component of a much larger record-keeping system. Working during the early morning hours when the family was still asleep, Aisling systematically searched the manor's study and found additional documents that painted a picture of methodical evil spanning decades. Household purchasing records showed a pattern that made her blood run cold. The Croftwoods ordered extraordinary quantities of exotic spices, particularly those used for preserving and flavoring meat, but their purchases of beef, pork, and poultry from local suppliers were minimal. For a family that regularly hosted elaborate dinner parties, the discrepancy suggested that their protein came from sources not recorded in conventional commercial transactions. Shipping manifests revealed regular deliveries of materials that had no obvious connection to mining operations or household management. Large quantities of salt for preservation, industrial chemicals suitable for dissolving organic matter, and most damning of all, anatomical specimen jars of the type used by medical schools for preserving human remains, disguised in the paperwork as medical supplies for the company doctor. A careful cross-reference of the dinner party guest lists with missing person reports from surrounding counties revealed a pattern that would have been obvious to anyone with access to the complete records. Businessmen, investors, and travelers who attended prosperity dinners at Croftwood Manor had a disturbing tendency to vanish entirely from the historical record within days of their visits. The financial records were equally revealing. The Croftwood mining operation was profitable, but not spectacularly so. Certainly not enough to support the family's lavish lifestyle and extensive real estate holdings. But periodic deposits from unnamed sources, always in amounts consistent with the liquidation of substantial personal effects, suggested alternative income streams that the family preferred not to document officially. Most chilling of all was a correspondence file containing letters from the Croftwood sons at university. The young men's missives revealed a growing awareness of their family's true nature and an increasing reluctance to return home for visits. The most recent letter, dated just 2 months earlier, contained a passage that left no doubt about what the boys had learned during their last vacation in glory. Father, I cannot in good conscience participate in your entertainments any longer. What you and Mother have built in that valley is an abomination that violates every principle of civilization and morality. I will complete my studies and make my own way in the world, but I will not be party to your appetites or your philosophy. Please do not contact me again unless you are prepared to abandon these practices entirely. The letter was signed by both sons and marked "Return to Sender" in Silas's distinctive handwriting, Apparently, the young men's moral objections had been noted and dismissed by their parents, who had continued their predations without regard for their children's horror. Eisling's analysis revealed that the harvest feast represented more than just another opportunity for the family to indulge their cannibalistic appetites. The guest list included several of the most prominent businessmen in the region, men whose disappearance would attract attention and potentially trigger investigations. The Croftwoods were planning to eliminate multiple potential threats while simultaneously acquiring substantial assets for liquidation. The numbers painted a clear, horrifying picture of an efficient operation built on human flesh, one that had operated with impunity for at least 20 years and showed no signs of voluntary cessation. If Eisling and Neve were going to act, they needed to ensure that their intervention was comprehensive enough to end the horror permanently. The morning of September 22nd dawned gray and misty, with the promise of rain before evening. The household bustled with preparations for the harvest feast, the most elaborate dinner party of the Croftwood social season. 12 guests were expected, all prominent businessmen from distant cities, and the menu had been planned with the exacting attention to detail that characterized all of Eliza's entertainments. Eisling and Neve moved through their duties with the mechanical precision of condemned prisoners completing their final tasks. They polished silver, arranged flowers, and prepared the dining room with the same careful attention they had always given to such occasions. But their minds were focused entirely on the evening's hidden agenda. The centerpiece of the meal was to be Eliza's famous harvest stew, a rich and complex dish that traditionally incorporated dozens of spices and seasonings to create a flavor profile that guests invariably declared unforgettable. The recipe was a closely guarded family secret, passed down through generations of Southern hostesses, and Eliza took personal pride in its preparation. What Eliza did not know was that her trusted kitchen staff had made subtle modifications to the traditional ingredients. The hemlock extract, bitter but well disguised by the robust flavors of the stew, had been incorporated into the base stock. The foxglove tincture, colorless and nearly tasteless, had been added to the wine that would accompany the meal. Even the bread had been treated with a mild paralytic agent derived from local mushrooms, ensuring that any guests who survived the primary poisons would be too incapacitated to flee or call for help. Before we continue with this tale of justice served cold, I want you to remember that monsters often wear the most civilized faces. If you're finding this story as chilling as I am, subscribe so you never miss the stories that expose the darkness hidden in history's shadows. The guests began arriving at sunset, their carriages clattering up the winding road to the manor with the confidence of men accustomed to comfortable accommodations and profitable ventures. They were greeted with the usual warmth and attention, offered pre-dinner drinks in the parlor, while Silas regaled them with stories of local history and mining prospects. Eliza moved among the visitors with her characteristic grace, inquiring after their families and business interests with the focused attention that made each man feel uniquely valued. She noted which guests were traveling alone, which had left detailed itineraries with their associates, and which carried themselves with the authority of men whose disappearances would be thoroughly investigated. When dinner was announced, the party moved to the dining room with the cheerful anticipation that characterized all successful social gatherings. The table was set with the finest china and crystal, the centerpiece arranged with autumn flowers and seasonal fruits, the lighting provided by dozens of candles that cast a warm and intimate glow over the assembled company. Silas offered his traditional toast as the first course was served. "Gentlemen, we are gathered tonight not merely to share a meal, but to partake in the essence of prosperity itself. What we consume becomes part of us, and what becomes part of us shapes our future. May this feast nourish us all in ways we have yet to imagine." The irony of his words was lost on the guests, who raised their glasses with the hearty enthusiasm of men celebrating their own success. They had no way of knowing that they were drinking their own deaths, consuming their own destruction with every appreciative swallow. The conversation over the early courses was animated and wide-ranging, covering politics, business, and philosophy, with the confident authority that comes from substantial wealth and social position. The guests complimented their hostess on the excellence of the meal, particularly the complexity and richness of the harvest stew, which several declared the finest they had ever tasted. It was during the third course that the first symptoms began to manifest. Thomas Mitchell, a railroad investor from Pittsburgh, suddenly clutched his chest and began breathing with obvious difficulty. His face flushed, then grew pale, and he attempted to stand before collapsing back into his chair with a look of confusion and growing panic. Within minutes, similar symptoms spread throughout the dining room. Men who had been laughing and talking began to gasp and choke. Some tried to rise from the table, only to find their legs too weak to support their weight. Others called out for help in voices that grew progressively weaker and more desperate. Silas Croftwood himself stood halfway through the meal, his face purple with rage and impending death, before falling forward into his plate with a crash that sent china and crystal cascading to the floor. Eliza managed only a single questioning look at her kitchen staff before the cardiac poisons overwhelmed her system and sent her sprawling across the polished mahogany table. Chaos erupted as the poison took swift effect throughout the dining room. Chairs overturned, glasses shattered, and the carefully orchestrated elegance of the evening dissolved into a tableau of agony and terror. The sounds of choking and pleading filled the air, gradually giving way to a silence more profound than any the manor had ever known. In the kitchen, Aisling calmly wrote a single phrase in Gaelic on the slate, where Eliza normally recorded grocery lists and menu notes. Gon Deana an diabal draimir de namdo droma. May the devil make a ladder of your backbone. It was not a confession or a boast, but a verdict delivered by judges who had seen enough evidence to render their decision. The two women slipped out the servants' entrance into the swirling mist of the September night, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the satisfaction of having turned predators into prey. By the time the sun rose, the house was silent, but the mystery of the maids had only just begun. The official investigation into what the Charleston newspapers would later term the Glory Valley Massacre began 3 days after the bodies were discovered. Sheriff William Porter, accompanied by the state coroner and 2 deputies, arrived at Croftwood Manor to find a scene that defied conventional explanation and challenged comfortable assumptions about the nature of civilized society. 23 people had died in the dining room, their bodies arranged around a table set for an elegant dinner party. The victims included not only the Croftwood family, but also some of the most prominent businessmen in the region, men whose disappearance had already triggered inquiries from powerful associates in distant cities. The preliminary examination revealed that all of the victims had died from ingesting a combination of plant-based toxins, primarily hemlock and foxglove, administered in sufficient quantities to ensure swift and inevitable death. The poisons had been skillfully concealed in the food and wine, suggesting both botanical knowledge and careful planning on the part of the perpetrators. The only suspects were the 2 Irish maids who had served in the household, Aisling and Neve O'Donnell, who had vanished without a trace on the night of the dinner party. A perfunctory search of the surrounding wilderness found no sign of their passage, and inquiries at neighboring settlements produced no reliable sightings of 2 women matching their descriptions. The official report, filed with the state capitol and preserved in the archives to this day, attributed the massacre to persons unknown presumed to be disgruntled household staff of foreign origin, motivated by theft and personal grievance. The case was classified as solved, though no arrests were ever made and no evidence was ever presented to support the conclusions reached by the investigating authorities. But the official story, satisfying as it was to those who preferred simple explanations for complex horrors, missed the deeper truth of what had occurred in the Croftwood dining room. This was not a crime of opportunity or desperation, but a carefully planned execution carried out by women who had discovered the full extent of their employer's monstrous appetites. The hidden larder, when finally discovered by investigators, contained the personal effects of more than 30 people who had supposedly died in mining accidents or departed the valley for destinations unknown. The coded menu found among Silas's papers revealed a systematic program of murder and cannibalism spanning more than 2 decades. Most damning of all was the Gaelic curse scrawled on the kitchen slate, which a local priest eventually translated for the mystified authorities. "May the devil make a ladder of your backbone" was not the random graffiti of ignorant immigrants, but a specific and traditional curse reserved for those who had violated the most fundamental taboos of human society. The maids had not simply killed to escape their own deaths, though their lives were certainly in immediate danger. They had identified a cancer in the heart of their community and chosen to excise it with surgical precision, using the family's own methods of concealment and deception against them. Every guest at that final dinner had been complicit in the Croftwoods' crimes, either as knowing participants or willfully ignorant beneficiaries. The systematic targeting of the entire network ensured that the cannibal operation would end permanently, rather than simply transferring to new management under different leadership. The transformation from servants to executioners was complete when Aisling wrote her curse on the kitchen slate and walked away from the scene of her judgment. She and Neve had become something far more dangerous than angry employees or desperate criminals. They had become the instruments of a justice that civilized society was too squeamish to administer through conventional channels. The official story saw murderers fleeing from their crimes, but the legend saw avenging angels who used the family's own tools of secrecy and poison against them. The economic collapse of Glory began within days of the massacre and accelerated rapidly as the full scope of the Croftwood family's crimes became apparent to the surviving community. The mine, dependent on capital investments that would never materialize, ceased operations by the end of October. The company store, its credit extended against assets that no longer existed, closed its doors permanently before the first snow. Without the Croftwood payroll to support local businesses, the settlement began to empty as families sought employment elsewhere. The boarding houses that had housed immigrant workers stood vacant by Christmas, their windows boarded and their furnishings sold at auction for whatever prices they could command. The manor itself became the focus of scavenger raids as desperate residents sought to salvage anything of value from the scene of the massacre. Furniture, paintings, jewelry, and books disappeared piece by piece until only the shell of the building remained, too large and too infamous to attract legitimate buyers or new occupants. In the spring of 1910, a fire of suspicious origin consumed what remained of the Croftwood estate. Some blamed lightning from a particularly violent thunderstorm, while others suspected arson by parties unknown who wished to erase the physical evidence of the family's crimes. Regardless of its cause, the fire burned for 3 days and nights, reducing the manor to a blackened foundation that would gradually be reclaimed by the encroaching wilderness. The Croftwood sons, inheritors of nothing but a cursed name and the horrifying knowledge of their parents' true nature, abandoned their family identity entirely. Legal records show that both young men changed their names within months of the massacre, relocated to distant states, and severed all connections to their West Virginia origins. They lived out their lives as respectable citizens of their adopted communities, carrying their terrible secret in silence until their deaths many decades later. The official record maintained in the state archives and accessible to researchers with sufficient determination lists the Glory Valley incident as a mass poisoning perpetrated by persons unknown. The file contains Sheriff Porter's initial report, the coroner's findings, and a brief summary of the unsuccessful search for the fugitive maids, but makes no mention of the hidden larder or the evidence of systematic cannibalism. Local memory proved more persistent than official documentation. Stories of the cannibal family and their Irish executioners spread throughout the mountain communities of West Virginia, passed down through generations of storytellers who understood that some truths were too important to be left to historians and government clerks. The legend that emerged from these oral traditions bore little resemblance to the sanitized version preserved in state records. In the stories told around winter fires, the O'Donnell cousins became avenging spirits who had delivered divine justice to creatures masquerading as human beings. Their disappearance into the mist was not the flight of guilty criminals, but the return of supernatural agents to whatever realm had sent them. As the town died around the ruins of the manor, the physical evidence of the Croftwood crimes gradually disappeared beneath layers of vegetation and accumulated debris. But the story was born in that destruction, growing stronger as the material world that had supported it crumbled away. Glory became a ghost town, but its ghosts carried a message that would outlive stone and steel. As the town died, the story was born, but not in history books, in the whispers that travel on the night wind. More than a century has passed since the night of the harvest feast, but the ruins of Glory continue to attract visitors drawn by the persistence of local legends and the inexplicable feelings that seem to permeate the abandoned valley. Urban explorers, paranormal investigators, and curious hikers regularly make the difficult journey to what remains of the Croftwood estate, though few leave without experiencing something that challenges their assumptions about the relationship between past and present. The most commonly reported phenomenon is olfactory rather than visual. Visitors frequently describe catching the scent of bitter almonds and roasting meat on the autumn air, particularly around the anniversary of the massacre. The smell is strong enough to be unmistakable, but brief enough to leave observers questioning whether they actually experienced it or simply imagined it in response to their knowledge of the location's history. More disturbing are the sightings of two women in old-fashioned dresses, reported with remarkable consistency by independent witnesses over the course of many decades. The figures are typically seen gathering herbs and flowers in the misty areas around the manor foundation, moving with purposeful efficiency until they notice human observers and vanish without a trace. Professional photographers have attempted to document these apparitions with mixed results that only deepen the mystery. Some images show nothing more than typical forest scenery, while others contain unexplained shadows or light anomalies that could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity. Most compelling are the photographs that clearly show two human figures in the middle distance, figures that become increasingly indistinct upon magnification and ultimately resolve into nothing more than patterns of light and shadow that should not have resembled human forms at all. The local communities that replaced Glory have developed their own traditions around the ruins, treating the site with a mixture of reverence and caution that suggests deeper knowledge than they are willing to share with outsiders. Children are warned away from the area, particularly during the late summer months, when the toxic plants that once served as instruments of justice reach their peak potency. Folklorists who have studied the regional legends classify the Glory Valley story as an example of the feast that eats itself, a recurring motif in Appalachian storytelling, where predators are ultimately consumed by their own appetites. The tale serves as both entertainment and moral instruction, warning listeners about the dangers of unchecked power and the inevitability of justice, even when conventional authorities prove inadequate to the task. Modern law enforcement agencies occasionally receive reports of suspicious activity in the Glory Valley area, typically from hikers who claim to have witnessed evidence of ongoing criminal behavior. These reports invariably prove impossible to substantiate, leading investigators to conclude that the combination of isolation, local legends, and natural atmospheric conditions creates an environment particularly conducive to imagination and misinterpretation. Yet the reports persist with a consistency that troubles experienced officers familiar with the difference between random false alarms and genuinely anomalous patterns. Something continues to happen in the ruins of Glory, something that defies easy categorization but leaves reliable witnesses convinced that they have encountered forces beyond their understanding. The record's closed, but the story is not finished, because a legend only dies when the last person stops listening. Historical accuracy becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when dealing with events that occurred more than a century ago, particularly when those events involved crimes so shocking that contemporary authorities preferred to obscure rather than illuminate the facts. The official records contradict the local legends. The physical evidence has long since disappeared, and the witnesses are all dead. What remains undisputed, however, is a single piece of carved slate discovered among the ruins of the Croftwood Manor by archaeologists conducting a survey of abandoned settlements in the 1970s. The slate bears a message written in Irish Gaelic, carved deeply enough into the stone to survive decades of weather and vandalism. Go Indiana an diabal draimir de knamfdo droma. The translation, confirmed by multiple academic sources, leaves no room for misinterpretation. May the devil make a ladder of your backbone. It is a traditional curse reserved for those who have committed sins so fundamental that they place themselves outside the protection of both divine mercy and human society. The curse was not carved randomly or in haste. The letters are precisely formed, evenly spaced, and positioned on the slate with the careful attention of someone creating a permanent record. This was not graffiti or vandalism, but a deliberate statement intended to survive long after its creators had departed. More importantly, the curse was not a confession of guilt or a boast about criminal accomplishments. It was a verdict delivered by judges who had seen enough evidence to render their decision and possessed the moral authority to execute the sentence they had imposed. The transformation of the O'Donnell cousins from victims to executioners was completed in the moment Aisling carved those words into the kitchen slate. They had passed judgment on a house that consumed people, using the family's own methods of concealment and deception to ensure that the consumption would ultimately be reciprocal. The slate stands today in the West Virginia State Museum, labeled simply as Gaelic inscription, origin unknown, circa 1910. Museum visitors who pause to read the translation rarely understand its significance, but those familiar with the Glory Valley legends recognize it immediately as the only authentic relic of a justice too terrible for history books to record. Subscribe if you believe some truths are worth preserving, even when history tries to bury them, because the stories that survive in whispers often contain more honesty than the official records kept by those who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The official investigation concluded that the massacre resulted from a crime of opportunity perpetrated by disgruntled servants, but the curse carved in stone tells a different story. It speaks of deliberate judgment delivered by women who had discovered horrors that civilized society refused to acknowledge, and who chose to end those horrors through methods that conventional justice was too squeamish to employ. The house consumed its guests for decades, but in the end, the house consumed itself, destroyed by the very appetites that had sustained it. The curse was not a threat or a wish, but a simple statement of fact, carved by hands that had turned predators into prey and served justice with the same precision that their employers had once used to serve human flesh. The factual record of the Glory Valley Massacre will never be complete. Too many documents were lost or deliberately destroyed. Too many witnesses carried their knowledge to unmarked graves. And too many years have passed for conventional historical research to reconstruct the full truth of what occurred in that remote West Virginia valley during the autumn of 1809. But facts are not the only way that truth survives across the generations. Stories carry their own kind of evidence, particularly stories that persist despite official efforts to suppress them. Stories that grow stronger rather than weaker as the physical world that supported them crumbles into dust. The slate with its carved curse has weathered more than a century of mountain storms. Its message as clear today as it was on the night Aisling O'Donnell carved it into the stone. Museum visitors who pause to read the translation rarely understand its full significance, but the words themselves remain, waiting for someone with sufficient knowledge to decode their meaning. The ruins of glory are visited regularly by people drawn by legends they may not fully believe but cannot entirely dismiss. They come seeking evidence of the supernatural, but what they find is something more unsettling, a lingering sense that justice sometimes operates outside the boundaries of conventional morality and legal procedure. Foxglove still grows wild on the foundation stones of the manor. Its beautiful purple blooms a reminder that the most dangerous things in the world often wear the most attractive faces. Hemlock flourishes in the damp areas where the kitchen once stood, its delicate white flowers concealing the same poisons that once transformed servants into executioners. The mist that rises from the Black Ash River continues to shroud the valley in the early morning hours, creating an atmosphere of concealment and mystery that seems almost intentionally designed to preserve secrets. Visitors report hearing voices carried on the wind, speaking words in a language they do not recognize but somehow understand. Local residents maintain their practiced silence about the legends, but their children still learn the stories around winter fires, understanding that some knowledge is too important to be lost simply because it makes adults uncomfortable. The tale of the immigrant maids who poisoned the cannibal feast has become part of the cultural DNA of the region, passed down through oral tradition and preserved in the collective memory of communities that understand the difference between official history and actual truth. The academic historians who study Appalachian folklore classify the Glory Valley story as a particularly vivid example of regional mythology, interesting primarily for its insights into the immigrant experience and the social tensions of early industrial communities. They note its moral themes and symbolic elements, but dismiss its literal truth as irrelevant to serious scholarly inquiry. They are wrong, of course, but their blindness is understandable. The truth preserved in the curse carved on the slate is too dangerous for comfortable academic consideration, too challenging to conventional assumptions about the nature of justice and the relationship between civilization and barbarism. The mist remembers what the history books chose to forget. The stones remember what the official records refused to document. And somewhere in the ruins of glory, among the foxglove and the hemlock, the truth waits for someone brave enough to hear it and wise enough to understand what it means. The screen fades to black, but the whisper of ancient justice carries on the night wind, speaking words that will outlive stone and steel, and the comfortable lies that civilized people tell themselves about the nature of evil and the price of survival.